Hello, and welcome to the K-State 2026 Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad you're here with us. This webinar started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have been able to reach over 113,000 gardeners just like you. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed participating in this educational webinar, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Extension. My name is Kenny Dodson. I am the Horticulture Agent for the Wildcat Extension District down in Southeast Kansas. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we have lots of love for educating and sharing important gardening topics with you. I personally love this series because it's a great way to reach everybody in Kansas, and anyone outside of Kansas is welcome here too. We get to see everyone's commenting in the chat, saying where they're from, what their weather's like, and what's blooming and growing on around them. Before we get started, we have a few short housekeeping tips to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to this presentation. There is where we will look for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A and during the Q&A session. You should see a button along the bottom that says Q&A. Click on that and you'll be able to enter your question. It also may be under a three-dot More tab as well. Today's webinar will be recorded and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share links through the chat, we will also link them on our website as well. Our website is where you'll have access to previous topics and the upcoming topics in the series. Our moderators today are going to be Anthony Reardon and any other willing participants. They will be sharing information through the chat and during the presentation. They will also help facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is natives versus cultivars, making informed decisions for your landscape. I am pleased to introduce the speaker for today, which will be Sharon Ashworth. And please give us just a few minutes while we transition to our slideshow. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the K-State Garden Hour. Is everybody seeing the proper slide?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, then we are off. So my name is Sharon Ashworth, and I'm the Horticulture and Natural Resources Agent for Douglas County. And we're going to talk about natives and cultivars today. It's also natives are gaining in popularity. Lots of people are talking about them. Lots of people are planting them. But then there are these cultivars. There's lots of different varieties out there that come from the parent plant, a native parent plant. So we're just going to talk about the sort of the pros and cons of this topic, and I'm going to focus on some of the latest research. So one of the reasons, let's see, make this go forward. There we go. Why people are so interested in natives these days is because they are typically considered low maintenance. And I always make sure to use the phrase low maintenance, not no maintenance. So the reason natives are low maintenance is they are adapted to local conditions. Which means they are generally heat and drought tolerant. Now, of course, not all of them. There are native wetland plants in your area, and those will not, of course, you can't move a wetland plant to an upland environment. But in general, when we were talking about upland plants, they do tend to be more heat and drought tolerant. They are tolerant of local soil conditions, and of course, tolerant of the local pests and diseases. So, which means that you typically can spend a lot less resources on these plants, less water, no fertilizers or pesticides on these sorts of plants. Now, to focus on the no maintenance, that picture there on the right shows a native garden that was established several years ago, but has not been quite upkept, and now it's been overrun by hedge parsley. And the yellow flower you see is golden Alexander's or Zizia, and that can really spread on the right conditions. So native gardens are not no maintenance. Of course, another reason people really love the natives is because of the pollinators. We love to see the butterflies, bees, and other insects that are utilizing these native plants. And of course, native plants support our local ecosystem. So here's the definition of native plant that I like to start with. It's a plant species is actually native to the ecoregion where it has evolved in concert with soils, climate, and fauna of a particular geographic region. And you should always add that geographic region when you're talking about native plants. Is it native to North America? Is it native to Kansas? Is it native to your county? So there are different ways to express that term native. So I want to start with that definition. And basically, this is a plant that has evolved with local conditions. Also, plants that were introduced to North America. So you might see some plants that are considered non-native. They do very well in your local environment, but they were introduced since European settlement, and they've done quite well. That's a term we often use to describe a plant that's been naturalized. And it does well without human involvement, but it was introduced when Europeans arrived, so it's not considered native. Now, the original plant species found in nature, the terms are often used as wild type or straight natives. I'll use the term wild type throughout this presentation, and that means the native plant. And another term that we should be aware of is variety. So you can see in that picture, Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed, and it comes, and you've probably seen this out in the wild, various shades of orange and yellow. And so plants do have a natural variation in the wild. And sometimes when breeders encounter that natural variation, they will collect seed from that, and that plant will grow from seed with the same characteristics of the parent. So that is termed a variety. In this case, the orange to yellow color in the Asclepias tuberosa is a genetic variation in these plants. Some people have speculated that it has to do with soil conditions or soil pH, but current research shows that it's actually a genetic component that determines the amount of pigment in the flower. So let's talk about what is a cultivar. So a cultivar is short for cultivated variety, any plant that has been modified by humans. And that modification can take the form of crossbreeding, hybridization, genetic modification, gene editing, anytime where there's a human involved in modifying that particular species. And cultivars are clones, so they're not true to seed. If you were to take a seed from a cultivar and plant it, you wouldn't expect the same plant at the next growing season. So cultivars are clones. They generally propagated through asexual propagation, such as cuttings. And there is another term that people use. Sometimes cultivars of natives are called nativars. I generally won't use that term in this. I'll generally use the term wild type for parent, but sometimes people are using the term nativar to refer to a cultivar of a native plant. And you can see a variety there. That's all in the pictures. That's all Achillea or yarrow. And this is the wild type here on the left with the white flowers. And then cultivars have been coming out in all sorts of varieties of colors. So that's one of the traits that people modify native plants for. So traits altered with cultivars. So oftentimes it could be height. So you might find dwarf varieties of natives. So native shrubs often have a cultivar that is a dwarf. This is a picture right here of aromatic sumac, and there is a dwarf variety called Grow Low. And so the cultivar will only get for a couple feet, whereas the native plant will get up to 6 feet. And so that's a way to allow people to have that native plant, but they may have a need for a smaller shrub. Over on the right, you can see this is foxglove beard tongue. So Penstemon digitalis. And on the top with the white flowers and the green leaves is the native. And below is a cultivar where the leaves are now purple. You may have heard about the cultivars Husker Red or Dark Towers. That's where the particular characteristic of the plant that's been selected for in this case are the different color of the leaves, so sort of a red or a purple. So we've got height, we've got leaf color, flower color is another popular way to manipulate the native plant. So this is a baptisia. In this case, you generally see them. You may see them as cream wild indigo, the blue false indigo that we typically see. And this is a hybrid of a couple different species. And now we've got, as they call it, pink lemonade flowers. And they're gorgeous. So flower color is often manipulated. Flower shape, the picture on the right, is also manipulated. This is actually an echinacea or a coneflower. And they've modified it so that the petals are, it's called a double bloom, where they have manipulated the flower shape. And here's one, Phlox paniculata. Now, this is a cultivar, but its originator was discovered out in the wild. And somebody had noticed that this particular plant or a group of plants had more flowers on it than your typical Phlox paniculata and bred that out. So cultivar, it's been asexually propagated and they found it's more disease resistant. The flowers are a little bit smaller, but there are more flowers on this. So this is a particular cultivar named Gina. So all these cultivars are basically designed to be more attractive and desirable for the home gardener, whether it's a shorter, more flowers, different color shape, something they've honed in on a particular feature and highlighted that in the cultivar. So what's the concern? Excuse me. The big concern that people are asking is, do the cultivars support pollinators as well as the wild types? And then to expand on that, do cultivars of natives provide the same ecosystem services, as the wild type natives? For example, are they providing food for birds? So basically, they think of larger, beyond pollinators, think of the whole local ecosystem, and our cultivars providing those services. So what I want to present is some highlighted research projects. But before we get into that, I want to make a couple key points. First, that insect populations are declining, and supporting pollinators is an action that we can all take locally and to which we can make a meaningful contribution. So what you're planting in your landscape matters. It matters not only for your enjoyment, it also matters for the local ecosystem. And I also want to point out that all these plants, whether they're natives, cultivars of native plants, and non-native plants, support insect pollinators. They just do it to different varying degrees. So in the poll question, the first poll question, I noticed a lot of you do have a mix of natives and cultivars and non-native plants. And that diversity is good. And we're going to talk about that more in detail. But what you are planting matters, and what you plant does support pollinators, just to different degrees. So the picture on the right here is of a bumblebee on a zinnia. So zinnias are not native. They originate in Mexico, Central America, but they support bees, and the butterflies love them as well. I see bees all the time visiting the bugleweed I have in my yard, which is also not a native. So what does the research show? So what I did is there's been now a plethora of research studies coming out. This is a hot topic. Lots of people are doing research all around the country, across the world on this particular question of cultivars and nativars. So I've selected a few that each highlight a different way of looking at that topic, that question. So first we'll start in Oregon State. And their research, by the way, they have a common garden research, a research common garden that they use, and they have a blog that you can follow along with on the research findings. And the study I picked out here is a 3-year study. They looked at bees, butterflies, and syrphid flies. Those are the flies that look like the bees, like in the picture there. And here's what they found, and sort of a mixed bag. So 37% of time, those pollinators preferred to visit the native plants. Cultivars, nearly 8%. And then for 55%, it made no difference whether the plant, the particular species they were looking at was a native or a cultivar. So, but what we find when you look at these studies is sometimes the native plants have a greater total pollinator visits. And then often a key difference is richness, pollinator richness. So in this case, they were looking at total pollinator visits and specifically bee richness. And what I mean by richness is how many different kinds of bees, how many different species of bees were visiting these. And that's what richness is. So there's total pollinators, like all the number, there's 1,000 bees that visit this particular plant, but there were only 3 species or 5 species that were using it. And in this study, they found that native plants had a greater richness. So more species of bees were visiting the flowers. And that is something that when you look at the literature occurs quite often, is that there's a difference in the types of species that are visiting. Even though maybe pollinator abundance is the same with cultivars, it's the set of species that tends to be different. So another study actually looked not at pollinator visits, but on insect herbivory. So those insects that are feeding on plants. And this study looked at woody plants. And here is the suite of characteristics of plants that they looked at. The leaf color, so they had the native type, and then the cultivar was a red or purple leaf color or a variegated leaf. They looked at growth habitat, so either the original size or a dwarf version, disease resistance, fruit size, and fall color. So they looked at all those characteristics of the native and then several cultivars of each of the natives. And sort of the upshot of it all was that they found that the purple, red, blue color, if it had been changed from the green, that was something that was consistently lower in terms of feeding. So fewer insects fed on those plants that had the purple leaves. And so that was, so they looked at all these, but the only one that was consistently used less by the insects was those with the purple leaves. And the hypothesis there is that when you have, what you're doing is you're increasing the pigment, the anthocyanin pigment in the leaf, and that those pigments are a deterrent for insects feeding on a leaf. And you may think of that, well, that's a great thing, right? Yes, insects are going to listen. But what we're doing here when we're planting natives is we're trying to attract insects. We're trying to support the pollinator and the insect population in our locality. So in this case, we want the insects to eat the leaves. Another study looked at monarchs specifically and the Asclepias or the milkweed. And this particular study looked at egg laying on the milkweed and compared it to the cultivars. So what this is saying here is that they looked at several different varieties of Asclepias or milkweed, and the incarnata, which is the swamp milkweed, and the butterfly milkweed both had more than the other types of milkweed. But the cultivars were colonized as to the same extent as the wild type. So it really made no difference whether the butterfly milkweed was a native or a cultivar. The monarchs didn't seem to care in this case in terms of where they laid their eggs. So that I thought was an interesting study, because most studies focus on pollinator visits. And oftentimes there's much fewer studies on host plants. And that is not, I don't want to say a fault of the research, but it's just that that type of research hasn't caught up. Most people are focusing on pollinator visits. So there's a lack of research. Now, this one, though, just came out. This is a new study from this year. And this is a much bigger project. So the diagram here is showing botanic gardens that are involved in the Bud Burst project. So it's these botanical gardens plus community gardens all across the US. And you can go to the website and check out the study that they're conducting on specifically on natives and cultivars. Now, the paper that I've mentioned here is actually, the paper focuses just on the eastern part. So it's the Chicago Botanic Garden and the community gardens on the eastern half of the US. But you can go to the Bud Burst and find out what's going on there across the country. This particular study, there we go, compared 4 natives and 3 or 4 cultivars of each native plant. And so this is spanning, like I said, the eastern half of the United States, which is a particular feature of the research that was missing in previous papers. A lot of times, research will come out of like Oregon State or a university in the South or in the Northeast. And so what these research did is they looked at different gardens on a much larger geographic area to see if the patterns are repeated. So what they looked at 4 natives, and I have them here: foxglove, beard tongue, black-eyed Susans, New England asters, and aromatic asters. And there are some of the cultivars that they compared them to. And I put these cultivar names here because you probably recognize some of these. Husker Red is very common. Vibrant Dome of the New England aster, October Skies for the aromatic aster. We're kind of familiar with some of these, and you might be too. So they evaluated 4 natives and 3 or 4 cultivars of each, and they looked at total visitation of pollinators. So not just bees, so bees, butterflies, beetles. They looked at total visitation, and then they also looked at the different groups of pollinators. So not species, but larger, what are called morpho groups. So different types, bees, butterflies, beetles. They looked at the larger groups and compared them. And so what they found, here's what they found, is that several of the cultivars matched the performance of their wild type counterparts. And I've put those here for your information. So the foxglove beard tongue, the Pocahontas, and the Husker Red did just as well as the wild type in terms of attracting pollinators and for the pollinator richness. The Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susan, it was Goldstrom, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, Viet's Little Susie, and then the aromatic aster. Those were the particular cultivars that did well. So the other cultivars of these native plants really were underperformed, and no cultivar outperformed wild type plants in attractiveness. So one thing to notice in looking through the research is that there's kind of a mixed bag of results when you go through the research. So some cultivars do better, some cultivars do worse, sometimes there's no difference. It's a real mixed bag depending on what plants you're looking at. Which cultivars did you choose and which native plants did you use? So it's kind of a mixed bag. So there's still a lot of research to be done. But there's a few key things that are popping up that I want to point out. So first of all, most research is on pollination visitation, not as much on the host plants or herbivory. I did show you that one study, but that's rather uncommon to see that level of research. And there's very little research on the chemical changes. So what happens when you change flower shape, flower color? Are there other changes that are happening in the chemistry of the plant that we don't know about? Are there chemical changes to the pollen and nectar, their nutritional value? And there just isn't a lot of work being done on that as of yet. So for example, focus on specialist pollinators. I've mentioned there's not as much work done on host plants. And I just want to illustrate why that's important, is you might have adult forms of pollinators like the fritillary here and the swallowtail. And when they're gathering nectar, they use a lot of plants, non-native cultivars, natives. They're using a whole host of plants to get their nectar, but they are very, very specific about where the caterpillar is. So for the fritillary, they're using violet species. That's where the butterflies are laying the eggs, and that's what the caterpillars are eating. And for the zebra swallowtail, it's those plants that are in the pawpaw family. So the host plant is very specific. So it might not matter a lot for whether it's cultivars or natives when you're providing nectar or pollen, but it does matter for the host plant. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Also, key points. So there have been a number of studies, enough that there is a cautionary, what is it, not cautionary tale, but a cautionary step when choosing cultivars is that double blooms do not provide resources for pollinators. And basically what's happening there is when you genetically manipulate these plants into a double bloom, what you're generally doing is you're taking a reproductive portion of that flower and you're converting it into a petal. So there's no nectar or pollen. There's no resource for the pollinators. So you've eliminated that. So if the carpels in the flower are replaced, you don't have nectar, you don't have seed set. So that has shown up a number of times in the research that double blooms do not provide for pollinators. Another thing that's shown up in several research studies is the purple red color of the leaves. If you start out with green leaves and you manipulate and you develop a cultivar with the red or purple leaves, that also will deter insect use. So that is those are common themes. Another thing to mention is there are hundreds, if not, well, thousands of cultivars to test. And research today shows that some are better than others. So it really depends on the cultivar. Some cultivars, as I've shown you, have done quite well compared to wild types and not so much others. So, and it can get a little bit more complicated. So overall, it seems to be that cultivars that are as similar as they can be to the wild type counterparts seem to attract as many visitors as the wild type. But just to throw in a little complication, what I've got the pictures are here are the New England aster. And so the one on the right is the wild type, and the one on the left is the purple dome cultivar. And what the purple dome cultivar is, actually it has more flowers and it's shorter than the wild type. So a number of studies have shown that cultivars that have longer blooming times and more flowers tend to be equal, and in some cases even better than the wild type for attracting pollinators. But in this case, you have one of these cultivars, but it didn't match to the wild type. And that was because of the height difference. The hypothesis is that actually the pollinators have more trouble finding those aster flowers on the cultivar than they do on the wild type. So they suspect that that's why, in this case, the cultivar didn't match the wild type, even though it has more flowers on it. So it can get a little tricky trying to figure this out. So a couple other questions. So overall, a cultivar's impact on the insect community is going to be dependent on the characteristic altered and the resource used by the insect, pollen, nectar, the tissue to eat. and of course the type of insect as well. So all those factors go into determining whether or not a cultivar is going to have an impact on the insect community. And so, for example, some questions, will the change in flower color still attract a specialist insect? The picture here is of the blue sage bee specialist on blue sage. So will the change in flower color still attract a specialist? Will a change in flower color, for example, alter the nectar resource? Is something about the chemistry changing with the nectar or the pollen when you manipulate another characteristic of the plant? And that's the final question is, will a change in the nectar resource change its nutritional value? Like I said, there just hasn't been a lot of studies on those sorts of questions. So another couple concerns that there isn't a lot of work on, but people are, like I said, this is a hot topic. So there's lots of people working on this now. It's crossbreeding between the cultivars and the wild type species is also a concern. And that really comes from the idea that a genetic variation in a wild population is good. So if you reduce the genetic variation in a wild population, you're reducing that population's ability to adapt to environmental changes. So one answer to that is to have a cultivar that is sterile. But if you have a sterile cultivar, that might prevent reseeding. It might prevent crossbreeding. Not all sterile cultivars are 100% sterile. So sterile cultivars are supposed to prevent reseeding and cross-pollination. But then again, if you have a sterile cultivar, you're not providing the resource necessary for the local insect population. So there's a choice to be made there. But the base level concern is that crossbreeding between the cultivars and wild types might be a concern because it dilutes the genetic variation of the wild population. So, but the problem for us, the plant buying public and plant growing public, is that finding natives, wild types, can be hard. This study here came out in 2017. It's improving. So this is just for the Mid-Atlantic nursery. Somebody did a survey and found that only 23% of the native plants sold were wild type forms. And if you go to your local garden center, you can check this out and find out how many of their natives are actually wild types or cultivars. And it's difficult to find wild types. So if you are in that situation, you don't have a dedicated nursery that has a lot of wild plants, you can consider mail order. I do caution to do that within your region because ecotype is a concern. So if you're going to mail order native plants from Wisconsin or Oregon, they might not be suited for our local environment here. Native plant sales. A lot of native plant sales are becoming more and more popular. Friends and neighbors dividing their natives. Talk to your local master gardener group. See who's dividing natives. See if they're willing to give you some. And to start with your natives. And then you can also start from seed. You can get permission from landowners or sometimes in public areas to start your own from native seed. So because it's harder to get the natives, if you've decided that's what you want to try is cultivars of the natives can be very useful complements to the wild types. As I've described, a lot of these cultivars can either match the ability of a wild type to attract pollinators. So they're good complements. And you still need to consider your own landscape. Right plant, right place. Just because it's native doesn't mean it's right for your landscape. You need to think about what it is you're looking for. So as I showed you in that first picture on the top, if you like golden Alexanders, that's one of the common natives you can find. You can plant golden Alexanders, but you got to watch it. And if you have a great uh, organic bed and you are watering it and you're treating it like maybe some of your non-natives, it might go nuts. And so you need to consider right plant, right place for your landscape. That's still always important. So how do you go shopping for plants? And trying to discern between the natives and the cultivars. So plant tags will often say that a plant is native. And oftentimes what they mean is the parent plant was native, but what you're looking at is a cultivar. And here's an example from a local garden center here where they say it's a native plant. In this case, it's the trumpet honeysuckle. And so, but it's actually a cultivar. And here's how you tell. So if you have got a native plant and it's a true native, it will have the scientific name there, genus and species, Lonicera sempervirens. Now, it might have a variety, and we talked about that at the start of the talk, and that will also be in italics. So right now, there used to be, when they first named these species, there used to be subspecies and varieties of this. Right now they've lumped it all into one, Lonicera sempervirens, but there used to be varieties that it would be Lonicera sempervirens minor, variety minor, or variety hirsutula. That's where, if you see that all in italics, genus and species, that is a native. However, if you can have the genus and species name, but then there's this other name in single quotes, and that's the cultivar name. So in this case, this is the major wheeler honeysuckle. And so it might say, in this case, it didn't say anything on the tag except for Lonicera, the genus. And you'll see that sometimes, but it's still classified as a native plant because the parent plant was native. But this, in fact, is a cultivar, and it's a very popular cultivar. It's going to, I think the change here, it was a little bit more manageable, and I think the flowers are a little brighter. I'd have to check back on that. But whatever characteristics they manipulated, it's asexually propagated, and it has the cultivar name in single quotes. So it will either be the whole genus species name, or it will be just the genus and then the cultivar in quotes. And that's how you know that it's a cultivar versus a wild type. So how do you determine what actually is native to your area? And these two resources are great to use. The Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses, Mike Haddock, that website, if you haven't been on in a while, has been updated. It's fantastic. This is how you find out if a plant is native to your region. You can also go to USDA Plants Database and type in the common name or the scientific name and find out at county level data whether or not the plant is native, where it's native. Kansas, your county, your region of Kansas, or wherever you're from, this works for everybody. So the USDA Plants Database. So that's how you determine what's native and the proper name for the species, so you know what to look for when you go look at the plant tag. So some key takeaways for this. Don't dismiss cultivars entirely. There seem to be some raging debates out there about whether or not to use cultivars. And as I hope I've demonstrated, it's a mixed bag of research out there. And it also depends on the type of landscape that you're dealing with and your gardening style. So don't dismiss them entirely. It's good to focus on diversity. If you want to attract pollinators to your garden, the most important thing you can do is provide a variety of resources, a variety of plants, a variety of colors and flower shapes, different heights. Focus on diversity for attracting pollinators to your garden, and you'll be doing good. As I said right up front, this is something that all of us can do individually that will impact our local insect populations. It's something we can meaningfully contribute to. And then if you are choosing cultivars, just be aware of what kind of cultivar you're choosing. The closest you can get to wild type, the more resources you'll provide. So choose cultivars that minimally deviate from the wild type. So they're either shorter, maybe a subtle color difference, or they have more blooms than the wild type. And then look to cultivars. It has been shown double blooms really aren't providing resources. So if you're concerned about providing resources for pollinators, don't choose the double blooms. I'm not saying don't. I mean, if you want them for aesthetic value, that's great, but they're not really going to provide for pollinators. So avoid the purple leaf cultivars and the double blooms and focus on what's close to wild type. But as I said, don't dismiss them entirely and focus on diversity, because that's what's really important. And then there are a number of resources for landscaping with native plants. I mentioned my Caddx book, The Kansas Wildflower and Grasses, in central Kansas, the Dick Arboretum. Now, if you go, that's another thing to do, is going to your local garden centers and going to places like the Dick Arboretum to see how the plants act in the landscape. So maybe you can compare them side by side, the wild type and the cultivar, or amongst the different types of cultivars, and choose what's going to be best for you and your garden. Missouri Botanical Garden has native landscaping, and you can look up plants up there. Grow Native, it's out of Kansas City, but there are a number of national resources. Audubon, Zero Sea Society, National Wildlife Federation, they all have these apps and websites where you can go and look up what's native. Kansas Native Plant Society is a fabulous resource for those of you in Kansas. And like I said, I mentioned the Dick Arboretum is a place where you can actually go see these various cultivars and wild types in the ground to see. So look at your local arboretums and local prairies even. And of course, you can always visit your extension agent. So they're going to know what works, what doesn't work based on their experience. Talk to the master gardeners at the extension office, because they're going to have on the ground experience with these plants and what seems to be working, what the changes are in the wild types and how that might fit your garden. So it's really all about just being aware when you're shopping, understanding what your goals are for your landscape. And then, understanding your goals and then choosing carefully from there. So, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Sharon, for that. That was wonderful. We do have several questions here in the Q&A. I'll start with the one up top. It says, for pollinators, is there any research looking at any difference in preference or richness between naturally growing native flowers versus native flowers that are planted or grown from seed?
Oh, excellent question. And no, I haven't really encountered much research about that, but except to know that here the context really matters. So in terms of a wild type, it's usually area and space has a lot to do with it. If you're looking at even a garden that's close to a prairie or close to a native area, you're just going to have more pollinators in that larger space with that much more vegetation and that many more plants, as opposed to maybe a smaller planted, more formal garden that might be surrounded by lawns, might be surrounded by infrastructure, buildings. So the context of where those comparisons is really important. So generally, you're going to find more pollinators in larger areas with more diverse plants. And so it really depends on the context there.
Hey, another person here would like to know, what is the difference between a hybrid and a cultivar?
Okay, well, a hybrid, you're basically taking two, you might take two wild type species and crossbreed them and come up with a whole new variety hybrid. And oftentimes you're not going to, you might see that on a plant tag where it has the little X on the plant tag and it'll show you that that's a hybrid. But both the hybrid and a cultivar, they're asexually propagated and you can grow them usually from cuttings. They don't come true to seed.
Awesome. And so Kathleen here would like to know, what is a specialist pollinator? Can you clarify on that?
Yes. So there are a number of insects that really, so plants and insects have co-evolved. And oftentimes what you'll find is that an insect is very, very specific about what it likes. It's only going to visit or pollinate a particular plant, as opposed to a generalist species. So, for example, you might think of a honeybee as a generalist species. So you're going to see honeybees on all sorts of flowers. They're collecting from all sorts of flowers, whereas you're only going to see either the caterpillar of a particular butterfly on this one species or group of species, like the pawpaw, or the milkweed. Another example, I like they're sometimes they're so specialized. There's something. Oh, now I'm trying to pull this up from long ago. There used to be a wasp. There is a wasp that pollinates a particular type of orchid. It's called a hammer orchid, and the plant and the insect have co-evolved so closely that the flower of the orchid looks like a female of this wasp. And so when it blooms, the male of the wasp thinks it's going to go mate with a female. So it lands on this flower and it's just a flower. But what the flower then does, it has a mechanism when a wasp lands on it. It's like a spring, and it actually flips the wasp that's landed on it over the plant down towards where the pollen sac is then connected. I mean, I don't have a picture of it, but it's kind of just the spring mechanism. And so the male wasp just gets tumbled over and then doesn't successfully mate and flies off. But the plant has been pollinated. And so it's fooled this particular wasp. So that's an example of just a very specific coevolution between a plant and its pollinator.
That is such a cool example. It's very neat.
There's videos of it out there. Just type in hammer orchid.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
There's another one here. It says, is there a difference in the establishment and blooming time between a native and a cultivar?
Yes, there can be. It really depends on what cultivar, but there are some cultivars that are selected for longer blooming time. So it'll open up earlier and go longer. So yes, there can be.
And I saw one here that's kind of a fun question. It says, if you could choose only 3 native plants to have, what would they be?
Everybody's going to have a different answer to that. So the basic answer for that is talk to your local extension agent and find out what their favorite plants are. I have a current favorite just because here in Douglas County, I get a lot of questions about how to grow grass under a tree. I need some ground cover. I got some bare spots, and we have a lot of shade in town here. So I always recommend the groundsel, the Pacra obovata is what it is. And it's just a lovely little evergreen ground cover, has a lovely little yellow flower, doesn't get this very, very short leaves. It is basal leaves most of the time. And so I end up recommending that a lot for this situation. But I'm sure everybody has their own situation. So talk to your local agent for what's the best and favorite.
Okay, so there's one question someone
Mm.
here had here about plant toxicity for pets, and I know generally we say talk to your local veterinarian, but do you know anything about natives in relation to that?
Well, I mean, just like any plant, I mean, there's a list on the ASPCA. Okay, somebody help me out with what that stands for. Uh, ah, ASPCA. Yep, I'm going to forget what that is. It's a list of toxic plants for cats and dogs. Uh, and of course, some plants are going to be toxic to livestock too. So again, talk to your extension agent about that. But there are wild type plants, native plants. Some are going to be toxic, some are not going to be toxic. I mean, when you look out on a prairie that's been grazed, you'll see where animals have avoided particular plants or not. And then some, of course, are hard to grow out in the wild in a grazing situation because they're like ice cream to livestock.
Yes, very good information. And Matt threw into the chat there that the ASPCA stands for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
Thank you.
So, there's one more question on here that is about grouping plants, more than one plant of these, than one plant of the same kind, and that being good for pollinators. Is that true?
Say that
So
again.
avoiding monocultures and grouping, various plants together, is that good for pollinators?
Oh, well, depending on what size landscape you're talking about, if you have enough room to put even a small group of plants together, you're going to attract more likely the insects are going to see that. They're going to notice that grouping. So having a group of baptisia here and a group of coreopsis and a group of this, that it helps the insects locate it. And then they have those resources right immediately there as they move from flower to flower to flower. Um, so those groups are great. Now, any kind of monoculture isn't going to attract that many insects. So in terms of you're looking at your whole landscape, you want diversity. So you want all different kinds of flowers and plants in that, like I said, different heights, different colors, different flower shapes. You want diversity in that. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah. So we do have one more question here. It says, as a layperson, how do you know if a plant you are purchasing is a cultivar versus a native? And I think you touched on this. So if you want to retouch on that, and then
Yeah.
how do we reliably determine if it's native in general?
Well, the native in general is to look at those resources like the Kansas plants, Kansas wildflowers and grasses. That will give an indication. USDA plant database will show you where things are native for the whole country. There's also something called BONAP. And once again, I'm bad with the acronyms, what that's going to be. Um, yeah. So let's stick with the USDA because everybody knows what that one is. I can't remember what BONAP stands for. And type in the name and find out if it's native. Depending on, is it native to the state? Is it native to your county? However particular you want to get, and that'll show you. And then make note of the scientific name of that plant and make sure you know the genus and the species. And then when you go to the garden center and you look on the tags, you're going to look for that entire name, the genus and species, on the tag if it is a native. If it has a name that's very descriptive, like white swan, pink lemonade is one I showed, and it's in single quotes, that is a cultivar. So they've taken some characteristic of the native plant and highlighted it through breeding. So look for those very descriptive names in the single quotes, and that will let you know that it is a cultivar.
Okay, well, I think that is all the questions we have. Thank you, Sharon, so much. And I will pass it back to Kenny.
Thank you.
We typically have more questions than we have time to answer. Sometimes we get them all, but we will be sure to link plenty of resources related to this session on our website. We hope these resources will help you answer your questions, but if you need any further information, office. Once again, thank you for tuning into the K-State Garden Hour web series hosted by K-State Extension. We are so glad you could be here today to learn about natives and cultivars and how they can help your landscape. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded garden hours in the archive or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session will be recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill out your evaluation survey. We would greatly appreciate any feedback. If you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again. We hope to continue to offer this every single month and have a great week.